As the passengers begin boarding the luxury private jet, a woman dressed in simple yet elegant attire steps onto the aircraft. Her presence is unassuming, her confidence quiet but undeniable. She carries a designer handbag, but it is subtle, not flashy. The flight attendant, a woman in her mid-30s with a crisp uniform and a firm expression, barely glances at her before assuming she is in the wrong place. "Excuse me, ma'am, economy class is that way," the flight attendant says with a forced smile, gesturing toward the back of the plane. The woman raises an eyebrow, momentarily surprised, but keeping her composure. "I'm sitting in first class," she replies calmly, handing over her boarding pass. The flight attendant barely looks at it before scoffing. "First class is reserved for our VIP guests. You must be mistaken." A few nearby passengers glance over, sensing the tension. The billionaire woman remains poised, her patience intact, but thinning. "I believe my seat is 1A, she says, her voice steady but firm. The flight attendant sighs, snatching the boarding pass and glancing at it with the intention of proving her wrong. The second she reads the details, her expression changes slightly, but she quickly masks it with indifference. "Fine," she mutters, "just make sure you don't take anyone else's seat." Instead of apologizing, she steps aside with an attitude, allowing the woman to pass, but making it clear she doesn't believe she belongs. The billionaire, unfazed but fully aware of what just happened, walks past the attendant, knowing that soon this woman will regret underestimating her. The flight is well underway, and the cabin is filled with the soft hum of engines and quiet conversations. The billionaire woman sits comfortably in her first-class seat, glancing out the window as the clouds drift by. She remains calm despite the dismissive attitude she encountered earlier. The flight attendant, still unaware of the woman's true identity, moves through the aisle with a tray of drinks, offering beverages to the passengers with a forced politeness. As she approaches the billionaire, her demeanor shifts ever so slightly, a hint of irritation flashing across her face. Without making proper eye contact, she asks in a clipped tone, "What would you like to drink?" "Just a glass of water, please," the woman responds, her voice calm and composed. The flight attendant nods curtly and turns to grab a glass from her tray. But instead of handling it carefully, she moves too quickly, and the glass tips forward, spilling ice-cold water all over the billionaire's lap. A collective gasp is heard from nearby passengers as the freezing liquid soaks into her expensive clothing. "Oh," the billionaire says, her voice even, though her expression tightens. Instead of apologizing, the flight attendant clicks her tongue in annoyance. "You should really watch where you put your hands," she says dismissively, as if the spill were somehow the billionaire's fault. She hands over a couple of napkins with an air of impatience, not bothering to offer any real assistance. The billionaire takes the napkins slowly, dabbing at her clothes with precision. Her face remains unreadable, but a sharp glint flickers in her eyes. The flight attendant, still oblivious, turns away to continue serving other passengers, acting as though nothing happened. The woman exhales, controlling her rising irritation. She knows she could reveal her identity at this moment and change the entire situation, but she chooses to wait. The lesson will be far greater when it comes at the right time. The flight continues smoothly, with passengers settling into their seats, some engaged in quiet conversations while others enjoy their meals. The billionaire woman, still calm despite the earlier disrespect, waits patiently for her meal to be served. She had specifically pre-ordered a special dish, something she had confirmed multiple times before boarding. As the flight attendant approaches her row, she is seen distributing meals with a forced politeness, her attitude indifferent. When she reaches the billionaire's seat, she barely glances at her before placing a generic meal tray in front of her. The woman looks down at the meal, then back up at the flight attendant. "I actually ordered a special meal," she says, her tone composed. The flight attendant exhales sharply, clearly annoyed. "Well, this is what we have," she says dismissively. "That's just how it works sometimes." The billionaire remains poised, her gaze steady. "I confirm my meal selection twice before boarding," she states. "Could you check the list again?" The flight attendant rolls her eyes, shifting her weight impatiently. "Look, we serve hundreds of passengers. Sometimes things get mixed up," she says, crossing her arms. "This isn't a five-star restaurant." The billionaire woman tilts her head slightly, observing the flight attendant's dismissive attitude. "I understand," she says calmly, pushing the tray slightly aside, "but I'd still appreciate it if you could check." The flight attendant sighs dramatically, muttering under her breath before walking away without a word. A few minutes later, she returns, carrying a tray with the correct meal but slamming it down onto the tray table with a bit too much force. "Happy now?" she asks sarcastically. The billionaire doesn't react immediately. Instead, she picks up the utensils gracefully and begins eating. She doesn't need to argue. Soon, the flight attendant will understand exactly who she just disrespected. The cabin is filled with a comfortable hum as passengers settle into their seats, preparing for the long flight ahead. The billionaire woman, still composed despite the earlier dismissive behavior from the flight attendant, makes her way toward her assigned seat in first class, 1A. However, as she approaches, she notices that someone else is already sitting there. A well-dressed businessman reclines comfortably in the spacious seat, scrolling through his phone as if it rightfully belongs to him. She pauses for a moment before addressing him politely. "Excuse me, but I believe you're in my seat." The man barely glances up, a slight smirk on his face. "Oh, I don't think so," he says, waving a dismissive hand. "You must have made a mistake. Maybe check your ticket again." She remains calm, pulling out her boarding pass and showing it to him. "It's 1A, that's what's printed on my ticket." Before the man can respond, the flight attendant, the same one who had been rude to her earlier, arrives at the scene. She immediately assesses the situation and, without checking the details, turns to the billionaire woman with an unimpressed look. "Ma'am, you need to take your assigned seat," the flight attendant says in a clipped tone. The billionaire raises an eyebrow. "This is my assigned seat," she replies evenly. 1A. The flight attendant sighs dramatically, as if dealing with an inconvenience. She then turns to the businessman and asks in a sweet tone, "Sir, is this your seat?" The man nods casually. "Yes, I believe so." That's all the flight attendant needs to hear. Without verifying the ticket, she turns back to the billionaire with irritation. "Ma'am, please don't create a scene. I'm sure we can find you another seat in business class." A few nearby passengers begin to watch the exchange, sensing the tension. The billionaire woman remains composed, though a sharp glint flashes in her eyes. "I paid for this seat," she states firmly, "and I expect to sit here." The flight attendant places her hands on her hips, her patience wearing thin. "Look, we're trying to accommodate everyone. You should be grateful we're offering you another seat." The billionaire inhales slowly, restraining herself from revealing the truth just yet. Instead, she takes out her phone, calmly typing a message. The flight attendant smirks, assuming she's just another entitled passenger who won't get her way. But what she doesn't realize is that the woman she just tried to dismiss owns the entire plane, and soon everyone will know it. The flight continues as the billionaire woman finally settles into her rightful seat, though the disrespect she has encountered so far has not gone unnoticed. She remains composed, silently observing everything around her. As the flight attendant moves through the aisle, assisting passengers, her attitude shifts depending on who she is speaking to. She is polite and accommodating to the wealthy-looking travelers, yet dismissive toward those she assumes are beneath her. The billionaire rests her designer handbag beside her on the seat, its subtle yet luxurious craftsmanship unmistakable. She reaches inside to retrieve a document she needs to review, but just as she does, the flight attendant approaches. Her expression is impatient as she gestures toward the bag. "Ma'am, you can't leave that there. It needs to go in the overhead compartment," she says flatly. The billionaire nods slightly. "I understand, but I'll be using it throughout the flight. I'd prefer to keep it close." The flight attendant exhales sharply, clearly annoyed. "FAA regulations require that bags be stored properly during takeoff," she snaps. Before the billionaire can respond, the flight attendant grabs the handbag without permission, lifting it roughly as if it were just another piece of luggage. "Be careful with that," the billionaire says, a slight edge creeping into her voice for the first time. But the flight attendant is already shoving the handbag into the overhead bin, not caring how it lands. The bag topples onto its side, nearly crushing the documents inside. The billionaire watches, her expression unreadable, but the tension in her posture is unmistakable. "You're welcome," the flight attendant mutters sarcastically before walking away. The billionaire woman exhales, her fingers lightly tapping on the armrest. That handbag wasn't just expensive, it contained confidential contracts worth millions. But she doesn't react with anger. She simply makes a mental note. The flight attendant, still oblivious to the mistake she has made, continues down the aisle, unaware that the woman she just disrespected is the one who owns the entire plane. The billionaire remains silent, knowing that soon the truth will come to light in a way no one will forget. The flight moves along smoothly, with passengers settling in, some reading, others watching movies or quietly conversing. The billionaire woman remains in her seat, composed despite the series of dismissive encounters she has faced from the flight attendant. She has observed the way the woman interacts with others, her attitude shifting depending on whom she perceives as important. It is a subtle yet clear pattern. A short while later, the flight attendant walks through the aisle, checking on passengers. As she nears the billionaire's seat, she suddenly stops, placing a hand on her hip with an exasperated expression. "Ma'am, I need to see your ticket again," she demands, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The billionaire slowly looks up from the book she'd been reading, unfazed by the sudden request. "Is there a problem?" she asks calmly. The flight attendant crosses her arms. "We've had issues with passengers trying to move up to first class without the proper ticket. I just need to verify that you're actually supposed to be here." A few passengers glance over, curious about the commotion. The billionaire remains composed, though a flicker of sharpness appears in her eyes. "I've already shown my ticket once. You personally checked it when I boarded." The flight attendant shrugs, feigning innocence. "It's just a routine check. You don't mind, do you?" Her tone is condescending, as if challenging the woman to protest. The billionaire exhales softly, reaching into her purse and retrieving the same boarding pass she had already presented earlier. She hands it over without a word. The flight attendant snatches it, scanning it quickly, expecting to catch a mistake. But as her eyes move across the details, her expression shifts ever so slightly. The ticket is indeed for first-class seat 1A, exactly as the woman had claimed. Still, instead of apologizing, the flight attendant simply hands the ticket back with a forced smile. "Just making sure," she says, before turning and walking away without another word. The billionaire woman watches her go, her expression unreadable. She could have corrected the flight attendant right then and there, but she chooses to wait. The real lesson will come soon enough, and when it does, it will be unforgettable. The cabin is filled with a comfortable hum as passengers settle into their seats, preparing for the long flight ahead. The billionaire woman, still composed despite the earlier dismissive behavior from the flight attendant, makes her way toward her assigned seat in first class, 1A. However, as she approaches, she notices that someone else is already sitting there. A well-dressed businessman reclines comfortably in the spacious seat, scrolling through his phone as if it rightfully belongs to him. She pauses for a moment before addressing him politely. "Excuse me, but I believe you're in my seat." The man barely glances up, a slight smirk on his face. "Oh, I don't think so," he says, waving a dismissive hand. "You must have made a mistake. Maybe check your ticket again." She remains calm, pulling out her boarding pass and showing it to him. "It's 1A. That's what's printed on my ticket." Before the man can respond, the flight attendant, the same one who had been rude to her earlier, arrives at the scene. She immediately assesses the situation and, without checking the details, turns to the billionaire woman with an unimpressed look. "Ma'am, you need to take your assigned seat," the flight attendant says in a clipped tone. The billionaire raises an eyebrow. "This is my assigned seat," she replies evenly. "1A. The flight attendant sighs dramatically, as if dealing with an inconvenience. She then turns to the businessman and asks in a sweet tone, "Sir, is this your seat?" The man nods casually. "Yes, I believe so." That's all the flight attendant needs to hear. Without verifying the ticket, she turns back to the billionaire with irritation. "Ma'am, please don't create a scene. I'm sure we can find you another seat in business class." A few nearby passengers begin to watch the exchange, sensing the tension. The billionaire woman remains composed, though a sharp glint flashes in her eyes. "I paid for this seat," she states firmly, "and I expect to sit here." The flight attendant places her hands on her hips, her patience wearing thin. "Look, we're trying to accommodate everyone. You should be grateful we're offering you another seat." The billionaire inhales slowly, restraining herself from revealing the truth just yet. Instead, she takes out her phone, calmly typing a message. The flight attendant smirks, assuming she's just another entitled passenger who won't get her way. But what she doesn't realize is that the woman she just tried to dismiss owns the entire plane, and soon everyone will know it. The soft hum of the aircraft fills the cabin as passengers settle into their routines. Some are asleep, some are engaged in quiet conversation, and others are absorbed in their entertainment. The billionaire woman remains seated, her patience unwavering despite the continuous mistreatment she has endured from the flight attendant. She has taken note of every dismissive comment, every impatient sigh, and every assumption made about her. She waits, knowing that soon everything will unfold as it should. The flight attendant makes another round, her demeanor shifting depending on whom she interacts with. She leans down to chat politely with a businessman in a tailored suit, laughing at his jokes and offering him another drink before he even asks. But when she reaches the billionaire's row, her face hardens, her tone clipped. "Tray collection," she announces, grabbing the empty trays from nearby passengers with mechanical efficiency. When she reaches the billionaire, she barely looks at her before yanking the tray from the table. The sudden force causes the silverware to clatter loudly, and a few drops of water spill onto the billionaire's lap. She exhales quietly, dabbing at the droplets with a napkin. "That was a bit rough," she comments calmly. The flight attendant huffs. "It's not my fault you weren't holding your cup properly," she replies dismissively, stacking the trays carelessly before moving on. A nearby passenger raises an eyebrow at the exchange, sensing the growing tension. The billionaire, however, remains composed, her expression giving away nothing. She has spent years in boardrooms where tempers flared and egos clashed, and she has learned that true power is in restraint. As the flight attendant moves further down the aisle, a voice crackles through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making our descent shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts." The billionaire slowly fastens her seatbelt, her gaze steady as she watches the flight attendant continue her duties, still blissfully unaware of the truth. The moment of revelation is near, and when it happens, the lesson will be one the flight attendant never forgets. The aircraft begins its slow descent, and the cabin is filled with the quiet rustling of passengers securing their belongings and adjusting their seatbelts. The billionaire woman remains seated, her expression calm, but her mind sharp. Every moment of mistreatment she has endured on this flight has been noted, and now the moment of revelation is drawing near. The flight attendant walks through the aisle one last time, ensuring passengers are prepared for landing. Her tone remains warm and accommodating toward those she deems important: businessmen, well-dressed travelers, and those who outwardly display wealth. But when she reaches the billionaire's row, her attitude shifts once more. "Seatbelt on," she says coldly, not even glancing at her. The billionaire, already secured, simply nods. The flight attendant doesn't bother to acknowledge it and moves along, her focus elsewhere. Moments later, the captain's voice comes over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to extend our appreciation for flying with us today. We have a very special guest on board, and we would like to personally welcome and thank her for choosing to fly with us." There is a slight pause. The flight attendant standing near the front of the cabin raises an eyebrow, curious about who this guest might be. The captain continues, "It is our honor to have the owner of this aircraft and our airline's most valued shareholder on board today. Ms. Billionaire's last name, we deeply appreciate your trust in our service." A wave of murmurs spreads through the cabin. Heads turn, eyes widen, and passengers glance around in search of the mysterious billionaire. The flight attendant stiffens, her heartbeat quickening. Slowly, she turns, her eyes landing on the woman she had treated so poorly for the entire flight. The billionaire does not move. She does not smirk, does not gloat. She simply looks up, meeting the flight attendant's gaze with quiet authority. The color drains from the flight attendant's face. Realization crashes over her like a tidal wave. The woman she had dismissed, insulted, and treated as insignificant is not just another passenger. She is the most powerful person on this plane. A thick silence hangs in the air. The weight of what she has done settles heavily on the flight attendant's shoulders. She wants to speak, to apologize, but no words come. The billionaire finally exhales, unbuckles her seatbelt and rises gracefully. The moment of reckoning has arrived. The aircraft lands smoothly, the wheels touching the runway with a soft thud. The cabin fills with the usual sounds of passengers shifting in their seats, some reaching for their phones, others stretching after the long flight. But there is an unusual tension in first class. The billionaire woman remains seated, her presence now the center of attention. Every passenger is aware of her status, and most are now watching closely, waiting to see what will happen next. The flight attendant stands frozen near the front, her face pale as she processes the reality of the situation. The woman she had dismissed, spoken down to, and treated with open disrespect is not just another passenger. She is the owner of the very plane they are standing in. The billionaire does not move immediately. She lets the moment linger, allowing the weight of the flight attendant's actions to sink in completely. Slowly, she rises from her seat with effortless grace. The air around her seems to shift, an unspoken authority radiating from her presence. She smooths out her outfit, adjusting the strap of her handbag, the very same one that had been carelessly thrown into the overhead bin earlier. The captain steps out from the cockpit, his face warm with respect. "Ms. Billionaire's last name, on behalf of the entire crew, we want to thank you for flying with us today." His words are sincere, his tone carrying the kind of deference reserved for only the most powerful individuals. The billionaire nods politely, her expression unreadable. She then turns her attention toward the flight attendant, who is now visibly trembling. The woman swallows hard, her hands nervously clasped in front of her as she struggles to find words. I had no idea," the flight attendant stammers, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to." The billionaire lifts a single hand, silencing her effortlessly. "You didn't know who I was," she says smoothly, her voice calm yet firm. And that's exactly the problem. The flight attendant's breath catches in her throat. "You treated me differently because you assumed I didn't matter," the billionaire continues, her gaze unwavering. "You judged me based on appearances, based on what you thought my worth was. And you did it without hesitation." The silence in the cabin is thick. Passengers hold their breath, captivated by the moment. The flight attendant opens her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but she quickly realizes there is no defense. The billionaire says, "I believe in respect for all passengers, no matter we believe in professionalismo they are. And I expect my airline to uphold those values." A single tear slips down the flight attendant's cheek. She knows what's coming. The billionaire steps closer, lowering her voice just enough that only the flight attendant can hear. "You're right about one thing," she says. "This isn't a five-star restaurant. But even here, the way you treat people matters." Then, without another word, she turns and walks toward the exit. The flight crew stands in silent respect as she steps off the plane, her presence lingering like an unshakable force. The flight attendant remains in place, her entire body tense. She knows this is the last time she will ever wear this uniform.